Hello, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff back with Economics Matters, the podcast. Today, we've got a truly exciting podcast guest. It's Karen Clark. She's co-founder and CEO of KCC, Karen Clark and Company. And we'll discuss the company in a second, but she's a leading global authority on catastrophic risk assessment. That's actually what the company does. It does catastrophic risk assessment. Let me just kind of jump to the bottom line. The National Underwriter Insurance entity has named Karen the sixth most influential, I guess, person in the insurance industry. She's credited with having started the catastrophic modeling industry. So just think about this. We have climate change underway. Some people think it's hugely expensive. We'll talk about the magnitude in a second. Some people think it's not that big a deal. But in any case, you want to model what's happening and understand what's happening and what are the risks of more things happening. And Karen, having gone to, I guess you said you started out at Western Maryland State College, if I have that right. And then she got an MA and a joint MA and MBA in economics and management at Bolshevik University. And then she went off and started this fabulous, extremely exciting company that's started this whole industry of catastrophic risk modeling. And a lot of this has to do, why was she successful? What has to do with the quality of the modeling and the technologies and techniques and the team that she organized to do this. She's continues to drive innovation, and she's developing ever more advanced and accurate models. And the insurance industry is really just in awe of Karen. She's got all kinds of awards. When the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change received the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize, Karen was given an award certificate, I guess, from this group or connected to the prize for her support of the work of the IPCC since its inception. Anybody who's working in the area of climate change knows about the IPCC's important influence on understanding carbon emissions and their connection to temperature. And reactions, I'll just say one other thing, Reactions magazine has ranked Karen the 14th most influential person in the insurance industry over the last 30 years. So we are really blessed to have Karen with us. How do I know Karen? I went to grad school with her husband, Pankaj Tandon, a colleague in my economics department. So I've really known Karen a long time, but we kind of bumped into each other at a retirement party for a colleague and caught up. And I knew she was working in this area, but I didn't know she was had started the whole field and was such a big deal. And also, since I've started working on climate modeling and how to, carbon taxation, optimal carbon taxation, I was kind of fascinated by talk to Karen about how whether you can infer from these models that she's developing what the true costs of climate change are. So Karen, welcome. Maybe you can fill in something of your bio.
Yeah, well, thank you, Larry, for having me, and thank you for that kind introduction. I think you were pretty thorough going through everything, but I'm not sure if it's good or bad for me to say I made my career on catastrophes. But that about sums it up.
So let's just talk about catastrophes for a moment. We have, if I look at the list, last year's list of climate events, we had record-breaking heat across Asia. Libya had floods. You don't think of Libya as having massive floods. They did. Enormous snow in Los Angeles. That's crazy. No, it doesn't snow in Los Angeles. Never happens. Cyclone in Southeast Asia, quite a substantial, Southeast Africa, severe sandstorm in Beijing, Cyclone Mocha in Myanmar, heat waves, dramatic heat waves in Australia, Typhoon Marwa, I'm not quite sure, Category 5 typhoon. We've had wildfires last year in Canada that burned over 40 million acres. That's probably bigger than Rhode Island, where I'm speaking to you from, because we moved down to Rhode Island during COVID. A Mediterranean cyclone, that was the one that caused the catastrophic flooding in Libya. Monsoon rains in India killed over 100 people. Vermont had this enormous flood. If you go to Montpelier, Vermont, if you were there when the flood happened, this river, which is quite low, it's probably 30 feet down in this river bed, and it's basically dry, all of a sudden goes up 30 feet and destroys Montpelier to some extent. They're rebuilding it. Heat waves in Europe, including 118 degrees Fahrenheit in Italy on July 24th. Transition to El Nino. And then we had kind of surface air temperatures close to or the warmest on record, and maybe this year is going to beat that. So lots of, and then I'll just briefly say that we have different estimates of the cost here of these events. In the US, there's been 11 last year. As of this year, we've had 11 confirmed weather climate disasters with losses exceeding $1 billion each, and 28 last year, $28 billion or greater climate disasters. That's the highest number since we started counting in 1980. Now, you might say that that's a large cost, but let me just say briefly that since 1980, we've had 376 major climate and weather disasters. The overall damage has, in each one of these has exceeded $1 billion, but cumulatively, that's only 2.6 trillion, 2.7 trillion. Now, our GDP this year is going to be around 25 trillion. So if you think about cumulative GDP since 1980, we're talking huge amount of money. So this is peanuts. On the other hand, there's a recent study by the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research that says that every year, if you don't look at the specific events and their cleanup costs and their loss, immediate loss, but you look at other things like the losses to agriculture and maybe disease, forced migration, if you do things a little bit more carefully and comprehensively, not more, but much more, you find $38 trillion in damages every year. Now, that's about 40% of annual world GDP. So that's far beyond anything we've included, I and my colleagues, in terms of the magnitude of the climate damage. So tell us what you think about the magnitude, about how much climate damage is arising, and then we'll talk about how you're going about kind of measuring its probability.
Sure. Well, actually, the numbers I'll talk about look very small relative to what you laid out, because I have to clarify that for risk modeling, what we focus on primarily at KCC is property damage and property losses from extreme events like hurricanes, wildfires, winter storms, extratropical cyclones, et cetera. So we're not really estimating the costs of, say, long-term heat waves, on health, for example, or on agriculture. We're very focused on property losses, homes, commercial structures, industrial facilities from these extreme events. So we're actually even globally talking about hundreds of billions. So, and I should say that's also, we focus on the insured amount. So most of our clients are insurance companies and reinsurance companies. So which also is actually an interesting topic, is that there is in other parts of the world, outside the US, Europe, Japan, some others, there's a huge protection gap. So a lot of the property damage, even from these perils, is not insured. But if we limit ourselves to just property damage, it's really in the hundreds of billions, maybe approaching $1 trillion annually.
Worldwide.
Worldwide, yes.
That's still quite a lot. I mean, if it's like 1% of world GDP, that just by that.
Right.
And that's like, I think climate scientists and economists have a hard time quantifying the damages, but this is kind of putting at least a floor on to say that there's $1 billion of damages. Sorry, it's
Hundreds of billions,
a trillion a year worldwide. That's putting a floor on the size, and then you can build on top of that. So maybe I should just quickly mention your website, maybe even to show it for everybody because it's quite interesting. Let me just share my screen here and take everybody over to your whole website. Let me just get rid of this guy. I know people listening by audio can't necessarily, so it's KCC?
Yeah, KarenClarkandCo.com.
Karen, oh yeah, here we go.
There you go.
So modern website, it's got, if you click on platform, which is the first menu item, see earthquake, Alaska earthquake, Australia earthquake, Canada earthquake, Caribbean earthquake, Hawaii earthquake, Japan. So you click on extratropical cyclones, floods, US floods, tropical cyclones, Japan typhoon. So wildfires in the US, winter storms, US. So you're modeling all these different events. Tell us about, and then you've got a list of, you've got a menu item on modeling, on the different models that you're producing. Tell us about how you go about doing the modeling. Tell us a bit about your company and how you developed it. And, at the beginning, how you came up with the idea. Give us a whole pitch.
Right. Sure. Well, I will say we have a very cool company, and by the way, we're always hiring. Our team consists of we have a very impressive team. So we have basically 3 different groups. We have our scientists and engineers who develop our model. So our team consists of a lot of PhD level atmospheric scientists, seismologists, geophysicists, wind engineers, structural engineers, earthquake engineers. We also have data scientists, of course. We have software engineers, experts in client services and in general development of software and models. So it's a really cool team. And that's what's really challenging about risk modeling or catastrophe modeling. You really need a lot of different disciplines because you said it's global. It encompasses all types of natural perils. So it really requires a lot of experts in a lot of different areas. And so it's really cool and challenging. There are always new challenges. There are always new issues coming up. Obviously, one of the biggest challenges we're dealing with now is climate change and how to incorporate that into our models, which we are doing.
Let's talk about retirement for a minute. It's something Americans think about regularly. Ask yourself, how financially secure do you really feel? Do you have enough money to retire? How much is really enough? And if you don't have enough money, how can you possibly find that extra money before you do retire? These are all tough questions. My retirement software, Maxify Planner, is the powerful online planning tool that takes the guesswork out of retirement. It weighs your assets against your fixed expenses to calculate how much you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life based on when you decide to retire. And it shows you safe ways to find more money. Maxify makes a complicated problem like retirement planning simple. It's accurate, easy to use, and produces what you really seek, peace of mind. So make the smart choice and visit Maxify.com today. Don't miss this opportunity. That's Maxify with an I, Maxify, Maxify.com. Now let's get back to the podcast. Are your customers asking you to model things in advance, the probability of, let's say, an earthquake or a volcanic eruption in Iceland in advance? Or is it saying, let's look at the event that just happened in Iceland, for example, where they've had continual eruptions near the Blue Lagoon.
Yeah.
Are you kind of being asked by the government to kind of understand what they should have known in advance about that particular eruption? Did they miss something?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it, because sometimes people think, oh, we do well when there is a catastrophe, but that's not true. We do well when people know there could be catastrophes or large event losses, because that's the main point of our models. It's to give insurers, as you said, governments, any kind of entity, really, what are the probabilities of future events? What are the probabilities of those events, and what are the probabilities of different impacts, financial impacts? So the whole goal of our team and the modeling is to give a future view of what could happen. And the reason that's so important is because you obviously have to plan. I said a lot of our clients are insurance companies, and they pay a lot of those hundreds of billions of dollars. So they need to know in advance, how much they should be writing in Japan or US or Europe, to make sure that they're not overly exposed. The last thing you would want is for your insurance company to go bankrupt, in an event and not be able to pay your claims. So the industry uses our models to make sure that they have an adequate spread of risk. There's also something called reinsurance. Insurance companies buy their own type of insurance, which is called reinsurance. So they need our models to determine how much they need to buy. And then, of course, they need our models to price the product. Okay, again, they have to know of these hundreds of billions of dollars, how much is coming from homeowners in the US versus commercial property owners in Europe, or Canada, as you mentioned. So the models are extremely important in risk quantification and risk management. Basically, the idea is so risk can be managed. As we always say, if you can't quantify the risk, you can't manage it. So you really need the tools that KCC develops to quantify the risk and then manage it.
Yeah, and just for people that aren't that familiar with the term reinsurance, it's insurance companies insuring themselves. I take on insuring, let's say, homes in Florida, but then that's excessive risk for my small insurance company. So I might make a deal with, let's say, Lloyd's of London in the extreme of, if they were willing to pay attention to me, to basically turn over some of that risk. And so if the event happens, I have a big loss, have a lot of homes I have to repair or pay claims on in Florida from a hurricane, then Lloyd's of London will pay me money. So the ultimate loss goes to Lloyd's, or at least it's shared with Lloyd's. And Lloyd's might be reinsuring with other companies or other individuals. And they also have Lloyd's, as I understand it, is a unique kind of company because they have partners. So the partners have their own personal money in there. So ultimately, insurance is about people around the world sharing risk. And so in their case, it's the actual partners who, if Lloyd's loses money, the partners, it comes out of their pocket. They don't make as much profits that year. But let me ask you about the modeling. Is the modeling, in economics, we write down models all the time, and they are all the same in the sense that they're all equations, and some are a little more some are kind of reduced form, kind of informal. Here's what I think is the relationship. I'm going to just kind of approximate the relationship. I know the amount of apples being sold depends on the price of bananas and oranges and peaches and fruit and income. So I can connect, so I can kind of have a reduced form relationship. Other people would write a very detailed structural model of the Apple industry and the sources of demand. Now, these other elements would come in, but they come in a more formal framework. We have, where you'd just get into a much more precise exercise of how many households are there, what are their demographic compositions, what are, can we model their actual tastes, and how does that lead them to demands for apples versus oranges versus peaches. Now, in your area, how much of the modeling is kind of mathematical like that, writing down equations? How much of it is empirical in the sense of writing down I wouldn't say, kind of frameworks that are predictive frameworks where you don't really care so much about the underlying coefficients, but you do care about the getting the predictions right, which then brings us to the issue of AI and whether that is something that using neural networks to help with a prediction, because that's just a way of it's kind of a predictive tool. It's a form of figuring out how to make the best prediction. It's not kind of completely foreign from what we've been using in the past. And then how much of it is just, hey, this is a kind of a one-off event we're talking about possibly happening in maybe New Delhi, and we haven't seen this before, but we know it could happen. We have to just basically take our team and give our best estimate. So I'm just wondering what the kind of mix of, when you say models, elaborate a bit on what that means.
Sure. Well, fundamentally, our models are simulation models. Okay, as you said, every event is unique. So what our models have to do is we need to generate a very large sample. Like you mentioned, wildfire. We have 1 million potential wildfire events for the US. So we need to simulate all the different characteristics. And I'll tell you how we do that in a minute. And estimate the losses so that we come up with a probability distribution. So at the end of the day, what our clients want to know is how likely are they to have $100 million loss, $1 billion loss, a $5 billion loss. So the output, it's called an exceedance probability curve. So it gives the probabilities of all types of losses. Now, there are two ways we can generate those events. There's a statistical way, which is basically, let's take hurricanes. Okay, we just had Beryl. Like if you've seen one satellite image of a hurricane, you've kind of seen them all, you know what they look like, circular, they have a little eye in the middle. So that we can model statistically. So we look at variables like storm track, peak winds, radius of maximum wind. So like about 15 different variables. Then we create probability distributions for each of those variables. Okay, so for example, how likely, and that varies by location. The key with CAT modeling is it has a spatial complex. So the probabilities are not the same in Texas as in Rhode Island, as you said, of having a Cat 1 or a Cat 4 hurricane. So it's very detailed. We have to look at each location. What's the probability of different wind speeds, of different sizes of hurricanes? So we have a massive amount of probability distributions that we've quantified for variables. And then we simulate, we draw different combinations to create possible events for the future.
So it's like a Monte Carlo simulation. so to speak.
It can be Monte Carlo, or it can be stratified sampling, or, some variant of that, but generally you can think of it that way. Now that works pretty well for earthquakes and hurricanes, but you mentioned that KCC is innovating and we're building more accurate models. And when you think about today, we didn't talk about this yet, but when we think of extreme losses, we think of hurricanes. That's where we're going to get the $100-200 billion events. But in the US, severe convective storms, that is the thunderstorms that happen every day, and where tornadoes cause twice as much loss on an annual aggregate basis. So about $40 billion a year of losses from these types of events, which are a lot more frequent. Think of the Weather Channel, look at the weather. These are what these events look like every day, going across the US. You can't model that with a set of parameters. So the innovations that KCC is introducing is using more physical modeling approaches. Now, I won't get too detailed, but there's something called numerical weather prediction, which these are huge models of the atmosphere in 4 dimensions. Okay, they're 3-dimensional, and then over time, where they're continually resolving for what's going on in the atmosphere. And so we've adopted, that type of technology so that we can more accurately simulate these type of events, which are more amorphous, more dynamic, much more difficult to model. So we're not limited, Larry, to one type of model. It's whatever is going to work best for a particular peril. That's what we'll adopt. And we are using AI and machine learning for things like derechos and tornado outbreaks to try to improve the accuracy of that. So we're continually embracing new technology and new techniques to bring them into our modeling capabilities.
Mhm. And when you do this sampling, you mentioned kind of drawing from different distributions. I'm kind of I guess my question is, it could be that there's 100 factors, each of which has their own probability distribution that ultimately leads to this event, and then there's the cost associated with the event, which you also has a probabilistic outcome. So I guess I'm trying to figure out how you would kind of combine these. You could just say, well, there's the ultimate issue of interest is the loss, and the loss is a distribution of all these elements, each of which has their own degree of uncertainty. I guess that's probably the comprehensive modeling you probably go for.
Yes, absolutely. And we do have to account for the uncertainty. There is a lot of uncertainty, so we have to build that in as well. And, that is part of, this distribution, if you will, of the outcomes.
Yeah. So it's rocket science, but in some sense it's understandable rocket science. It's it's not like you need necessarily a PhD in physics or statistics to be of help to your company. I guess you have people with those kinds of degrees, but also people that are probably involved in collecting data, and they can understand kind of the general idea of what's going on in these under the hood in the modeling.
Yeah, well, we definitely do need plenty of PhDs. I would say a third of our staff are PhDs in these different fields, because we definitely need them to build the models. But you're right, it's not exclusively PhDs, because we do have people doing, performing work where you may not necessarily need a PhD in that. But these are very high resolution models, first of all, very advanced science. And so again, it's very exciting to be able to bring all of that together. What I find very exciting about it is that you're bringing scientific, the most advanced science together, the most advanced engineering principles, the most advanced data science together. And at the end of the day, again, because I'm an economist like you, I get a financial outcome to kind of have a distribution of financial outcomes, which we can benchmark and have verify the accuracy of those outcomes.
Want more money, less risk, and a better life? Buy Money Magic, a new book by Lawrence Kotlikoff, Boston University economist, personal finance expert, and best-selling author. Whether it's education, career, marriage, housing, investing, retirement, Social Security, IRA, or 401k decisions, Money Magic delivers scores of secrets to raise your living standard. Financial journalist Jane Bryant Quinn says Money Magic is a must-read. Nobel laureate George Akerlof says Money Magic is quite probably the best financial advice book ever written. Financial guru John Malden says, you'll love this amazing book. It's full of wit, wisdom, and startling paths to a better financial life. And columnist Scott Burns calls Money Magic a funny, brilliant read, offering wildly powerful, unconventional choices that can literally change your life. Get Lawrence Kotlikoff's Money Magic today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and independent booksellers.
So, Karen, what's your sense? You've been at this for a bit. Number of years. I've been at BU for a few years myself, so I know some sense of how long you've been at this. Are you do you have the opinion that things are getting much worse over time as you've been involved in this industry, that we're having many more catastrophic events, that the costs are getting much larger? Is basically, what's your take on climate change? Not, your informed take based on everything you've seen in the data, in the events, in the modeling. How bad a situation are we in?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And again, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there in terms of losses, because while climate change is having an impact, which I'll come back to date, the biggest driver of increasing losses, there are two of primary drivers. One is demographics, and two is construction cost inflation. Okay, and those are why it seems like we're having, record-breaking losses every year, when in reality, if you looked at historical events with a constant exposure, really no records have been broken. In fact, for hurricanes, the largest loss today would be a 1926 hurricane that made a direct hit on Miami. Of course, in 26, nobody lived in Miami, so there wasn't much damage. But today, that will cost over $200 billion, which would be a record setter. And so if you think about what's been happening over the past several decades, where have people been moving? They've been moving to the coastlines. Okay, for example, the state of Florida, population has been growing much faster than the general rate of population growth in the US. So basically what's happening is we're building more, we're building bigger properties right in harm's way. So every time there's a hurricane, that hurricane just has more property to damage. It can be exactly the same hurricane, and it's going to cost more in terms of the dollar damages. Combine that with construction cost inflation. In the past 10 years, the cost to build the exact same single-family home has doubled. Okay, it's doubled. So every year we get increases in the cost that it's going to take to repair or rebuild your home. So again, if we have the same hurricane hit the same place that it hit 10 years ago, it's going to be twice the loss.
This is inflation adjusted, or is this?
Yeah, this is the construction cost inflation. So general rate of inflation. So I'm talking about the cost to construct a home or a commercial property, office building, etc. The cost to build these properties. I mean, a lot has been obviously impacted by COVID supply shortages, but in the past 10 years, that's doubled. So if 10 years ago we had a hurricane hit an area and it cost 20 billion, let's say, today, even if there are no more properties there, it's going to cost 40 billion. So,
and that's not just reflecting a general price increase. That's going above and beyond the CPI increase over the last decade.
yeah, it's the construction cost increase, which doesn't necessarily follow the CPI.
Okay, I see. Okay.
So those are the biggest drivers, and that's really where we're seeing the increase. And I think, there's a lot of angst on the part of homeowners that their insurance premiums are going up. And I think one thing that homeowners have to understand is that their premiums are calculated based on two things. One is, of course, the rate, but the second thing is the cost to repair or rebuild their home. So if that cost doubles, your insurance premium is going to double just because of that, even if there's no change in the rate. So I don't think people understand that insurance is a product just like milk or eggs or gas. So if the cost of that product goes up, then their premiums have to go up. Okay, so far, the biggest drivers of the increasing losses have been demographic shifts and construction cost inflation. Now, there's also been social inflation. We don't have to go into that, but that's been another driver. And then we have climate change. So how much is climate change impacting extreme events? Okay, so again, Larry, I have to make the thing, I'm not talking about heat waves or droughts or any of those things. I'm just talking about hurricanes, wildfires, and floods, for example. So hurricanes, the scientific consensus, again, from the IPCC, is that climate change is increasing the severity of hurricanes. And how it's increasing, it's manifesting, is we're seeing more major hurricanes, category 3, 4s, and 5s. Okay, so what we have done at KCC is we can go back and we can climate condition all of the historical data. So for example, I mentioned the 1926 Great Miami Hurricane, which had a particular wind speed. It was a Cat 4. If that hurricane were to occur today, what would that maximum wind speed likely to be? Okay, and that's going to be higher.
How much higher?
I don't have the numbers for that individual hurricane, but let's say it's, it would be on the order of maybe, 5 to 10 miles per hour higher. So what would that cause in terms of damage? But we have calculated, or I do have, on the top of my mind, the cumulative, like average annual loss increases in the US from climate change so far has been about 11%. Okay, so that's what happens if we go back and adjust the wind speeds for climate. You were going to ask a question?
Oh, 11%. Tell us more about that number. What do you mean by 11% exactly?
So for example, if we go back and we climate condition all the historical hurricanes and we bump up their wind speeds as to what they would cause today, and they rerun all the losses, or we regenerate our hurricane model, which we've done, and regenerate this probability distribution, the annual aggregate losses are 11% higher than if we use the original data.
So that's telling us pretty precisely in this particular area the cost of climate change, which is not trivial, but you're saying it's not necessarily the big picture.
Yeah, exactly. And in the future,
of the damage is really still from nature, Mother Nature, so to speak. But
well, and we have to face the fact that we keep building in harm's way. As a society, we keep building in harm's way. I think that's the major driver.
So another experiment would be, what if you had this increase in wind speed, for example, the hurricanes, but you had the same kind of density in Florida that you had in 1926, it could well be that this was dramatically, that a Cat 5 hurricane in Miami in Florida would have a very dramatically lower cost than would now occur. I guess you've done that kind of calculation as well.
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so again, you can look at it either way. It's like kind of the flip side, but normally what we do is we see what would happen today from historical hurricanes. Now that's hurricanes, but wildfires, it's different. Okay, so we've calculated since 1985, climate change has caused a doubling of wildfire losses. So the kind of extreme event peril that is most impacted by climate change to date is wildfire. The climate change is impacting both the frequency and the severity of wildfire. So that is kind of the largest impact to date, and we do see those impacts going out into the future. So for hurricanes, if we look into the future, we may say we need to add about 1% per year for climate change on hurricanes, where for wildfires, we could be needing to add 5, or more percent every year to keep up with climate change impact on losses. So it varies by peril.
Is that a statement about damages, or that's a statement about the probability of wildfire?
Yeah, those are the changes in the damages. That's what would be the change in the damage.
So 5% a
The
year.
increase.
Yeah. So is this linear or is this somehow exponential?
Well, the magnitude, the response of wildfires to climate change is not linear. Okay, it is exponential. And so, but when you convert that into losses, yeah, it's still not linear. So this kind of 5% is like the short term looking out for the next, let's say, 5 or 10 years.
I'd like to talk to you about a really powerful financial planning tool to help you make smart retirement and other critical financial decisions. It's a tool that factors in all your financial data and shows you what you can sustainably spend every year for the rest of your life. That tool is my software company's Maxify Planner. It's incredibly powerful, it's accurate, and it's easy to use. Maxify takes the guesswork out of financial decisions at every stage of life. Its focus is on raising, de-risking, and sustaining your living standard. Maxify lets you run what-if scenarios to see how your finances will change in taking new jobs, buying a home, doing Roth conversions, retiring early, downsizing, investing more in the market, you name it. Knowing the impact of these decisions before you make them is the secret to making smarter decisions. And it's also the secret to what we all seek, which is financial peace of mind. So please visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I, Maxify.com, Maxify.com. Now let's get back to the podcast. I see, but where that should continue at those kinds of rates, we're talking about catastrophic losses, that go beyond, I presume, the issue of people responding to people locating in the wrong place, kind of asking for it, so to speak. With wildfires, you're saying that this thing is going so badly that we can have people that haven't moved, who haven't experienced, areas that haven't experienced any wildfires for maybe centuries. Take Rhode Island, for example, or Massachusetts. I can't recall any wildfires, major proportion. Could they be something in our future if we think about extrapolate, or maybe your models aren't really set up to extrapolate that far into the future?
Well, we go out to 2050. Okay, that's how far we go out. And if we're looking at that time frame, there's something called the vapor pressure deficit that's the key driver of the increase in wildfires. That is increasing the most in the Southwest, actually more in the Texas, New Mexico, Arizona area. Actually, not, it is in California, but it's more in this area. It's less so in the Northeast. And interestingly, so it varies geographically again. As I said, it's not a broad brush. So in the Northeast, while we could have a large wildfire, it would be still a very low probability event. It's not going to happen and then that suddenly our forests are going to dry up and we're going to start having wildfires every year. That's not likely to happen. And areas that are vulnerable, by the way, I would say there is an area in New Jersey around the Pine Barrens. They already do a lot of prescribed burns, to try to reduce the potential for large wildfires. So it is regional, and when we model it, we take into account these regional differences, and the differences can be even on a 10 square kilometers. So as I said, our models are very high resolution, so they calculate these changes at the location level.
Right. If we think about Canada, we had this 40 million acre burn just last year. And of course, everybody in in New England experienced this because of the smoke. That's feels like it's bigger than Rhode Island. I don't know that we have 40 million acres. Still need to see Rhode Island acreage. Rhode Island, it says right here. Well, we have 1,545 million. Let's see, that's squared miles. Less than 1 million acres. We have 988,000 acres. So we're talking about something 40 times the size of Rhode Island. Of course, Rhode Island's a small state. I hope I don't have that, orders of magnitude off, and that somebody sends a angry statement saying you can't count. But how scared are you about climate change? I know there are some areas probably that you don't necessarily focus on, like the Greenland ice shelf melting, or good chunks of the Antarctica ice sheets falling into the ocean, the sea level rising. Maybe you do focus on that. And then I guess the Gulf Stream changing course so that we enter into an ice age in Europe. Of course, some of these things are way into the future, or sea level going up 15 feet, I guess, is probably maybe the worst case scenario. And then we're, of course, talking about tipping points. Once the sea level's up to that level, you've got maybe a third or fourth of or maybe 40% of the world population living on the coasts around the world. If I were a climate denier, if this was a podcast where I was saying everybody's just overly wrought about this, if we keep trying to adjust for what might happen, our small impact on climate, then more people are going to come into harm's way. We'll have kind of a green paradox here, that the more you do to mitigate the problem, the more people say, well, there's less of a problem, so I'm going to put myself more at risk, and then you don't actually have that much in the way of reduced damages. But so how would you, suppose I were a climate denier, which I don't view myself as, what's your position about climate change, or what's your view? How would you respond to me?
Sure. Well, first of all, we do care about sea level rise. It's very important, because I didn't mention yet floods, but our models account for coastal flooding as well as inland flooding, where again, the scientific consensus is we are seeing increased frequency and severity in floods, which obviously cause a lot of damage. So I would say that, climate change is real. I mean, there's just no question about that. We know that we are seeing changes, and, it behooves us to take actions. So I would definitely encourage anyone to make sure they understand that, climate change is having an impact, even on the extreme events that we model. But again, we work with the insurance industry, and the insurance industry has helped society manage risk for centuries. Okay, the insurance industry has been through depressions, wars, terrorist attacks, what have you. And really, it's a very robust industry. And so we believe that for our industry, we can quantify the climate change impacts, and they can be built in, and they can be communicated. And again, I think a lot of the communication has to go to all the way down to the policyholders, to the homeowners and the commercial property owners who don't really know what's happening when their premiums are increasing. Is it climate? What is it? What's happening? And so we do have to educate society more on the impacts of climate and how we have to pay for it. Because I do think there's a disconnect between, climate change is happening and who's paying for it. Okay, so homeowners that are living, for example, where sea level rise is going to be more impactful, which it varies by geography. Obviously they have to pay, they're going to pay more, or, the cost to them is more of climate change. So there is a cost all the way down to the consumer level.
So do we already see parts of the country that are uninsurable? I mean, is it the case that in California you can't get fire insurance these days, or it's just astronomical, and that the share of people that are buying fire insurance in California for their homes has dropped dramatically? I don't know.
Well, yeah. So Larry, there's a great underwriting principle, which is there's no such thing as a bad risk. There's only a bad price. So if insurance companies can price the product correctly, they can write the risk. But insurance is regulated on a state-by-state basis, and insurance companies have to get their rates approved. And in California, they have not yet allowed the catastrophe models, our models, to be used in rate filings. And of course, an insurance company, I may be willing to write the risk, but I have to have the right price. You're an economist, you know that. And I have to have a model to make sure I'm not overly exposed. Okay, again, our models are used for that. So, the other problem is that there's unwillingness in some parts of the country to have consumers pay the true cost of risk. It's hard in a state to tell California you're in a high risk area. You have to pay, thousands of dollars for your insurance. But that is the true cost of risk. So we just really have to decide, who's going to pay for the risk, because in California for wildfire now, a lot of the properties are in the FAIR plan. They're not written privately, they're given insurance. So if, they haven't been paying enough in the FAIR plan, then it's going to come back to the taxpayers. And even the Treasury, US Treasury, is getting interested in what's happening in Florida and these other states, because if, the states are not funding the risk themselves, it's going to come back to the US taxpayer. I mean, somebody's going to pay for it. It's just a question of who and when. Are we going to pre-fund catastrophes through insurance privately, or are we just going to tax people afterwards to pay for it?
So if we do it afterwards, if we make this kind of a everybody pays for Florida, now it becomes, rather than the current outcome might be, or for, let's say, Southern California, the current outcome would be the state has these regulations, the insurance companies leave, people are not insured, the state officials are forced to change the regulations to take into account, and then people have to pay more, and they naturally don't build as much, or so we don't have the influx. People leave California, and that's a natural economic response. Now, if you say everybody in the country has to pay basically any damages that are above some average in California, above the national average, have to be covered by the taxpayer, then we're going to have too many people living in California as a result, and then we're all going to, be facing we're going to have an inefficient allocation of people by location, costing everybody, including people moving to California, much more than would otherwise. It's an inefficient way to run the country and to deal with the risk. The other couple of things that come to mind here is that certain risks are not, in some sense, insurable. Even if you said we're just going to have a nationalization of insurance for sea level, for example, well, if the sea level goes up many feet and we wipe out large portions of the country, the taxes that would be required to cover that will be astronomical. And I think at some point it just won't happen that people will be covered. So these kind of aggregate risks that are kind of too big to be spread because they're not, maybe if we could spread them with Russia and Europe, and we had an effective reinsurance across countries, that could mitigate this. But if it's really global, then there's not much risk sharing we can do globally to deal with the entire planet warming up and the entire planet's sea level rising. It's just not, the only thing we can really do is kind of self-insure by reducing our carbon footprint, and that's where carbon taxation comes in. Another thing I want to mention in this context, do a little self-advertising for a paper called Carbon Risk Taxation I wrote with some colleagues, which talks about the fact that even if even if you're a climate denier and you think that on average there's not going to be any climate damage into the future compared to, we might have occasional ups and downs from the climate, but on average there's nothing really going on through time. Well, you still have to recognize that there's a risk that you could be wrong, and that risk is being imposed on your kids and grandkids and great-grandkids, and that's an externality that we don't usually measure or think about. We know that if we are a factory and we pollute the laundry next door, we pollute the air, and the laundry next door has dirty clothes, that's a concrete economic damage that we're imposing on somebody else. But if we impose risk, for example, if I put a gun to your head, Karen, and said, we're going to flip a coin 50-50, that you pay me $1 million or I pay you $1 million, you're worse off. Clearly, I'm imposing risk on you, or maybe it's just, yeah, anyway. So risk is a real thing that we need to understand has real economic costs, and we would want to, again, self-insure against those by taking steps today. And we found in the study of carbon risk taxation that Kotlikoff done on my website that the optimal carbon tax just to deal with the risk is larger than the carbon tax you would impose if there was no risk whatsoever, but you just use the kind of average losses that are now being projected. So that's an interesting kind of angle that connects to your work, because I think ultimately your work is telling us about the risk we're imposing, not just this year on this part of the country, but over time on generations here and abroad. And that's very important for people like me who are trying to model what we should be doing, where we have risks that are aggregate that we can't really share, even if we could share, even if we had the best sharing mechanism. So any final thoughts on where we're heading and what any kind of policy suggestions, given your incredible background in this area? Anything you would do if you were the climate czar, or the, let's say, the location czar, or just the czar, just uh, let's say Trump wins, becomes the dictator for the month or the day, and he says, I want to go golfing, Karen, you're in charge. What do you do?
Well, I think the first thing is people have to understand the true cost. I think it's kind of being hidden a little bit. You mentioned, I do believe, you said a lot a few minutes ago, I do believe that there's still a lot of room for the private market to diversify the risk globally, better than it is, than is happening today. So for example, you've mentioned nationalizing it. We've had the National Flood Insurance Program around for decades, and that has not really done much to, I think, mitigate the flood damage or to prevent people from building in flood-prone areas. And again, people are not really paying the real cost. So I think I'm a numbers person, so I think the first thing is to really put the numbers out there. What are the costs in these different geographic areas? What are the true costs? And what is that going to be 5 years from now? What is that going to be 10 years from now? Lay out the numbers. Okay, again, we need to quantify this. Once we've laid out the numbers and we say, this is what our costs are, this is what's happening. The second thing is, how do we prevent future increases? Okay, so what are the mitigating, when we have the cost, then we can compare to the cost of mitigation. Okay, so we want to mitigate the climate change. So how do those costs compare to what we're saving? And then I think most important, or not most importantly, but also importantly, is how do we want to pay those costs? Who, how, and when? We just have to make decisions rather than just letting things happen or evolve or what have you. I think just laying it all out, laying the numbers all out, would help, I think, to make some really good decisions.
Yeah, the decision not to decide is a decision really to leave it to our kids, to leave the
Yes.
burden or the risk to our children, the average cost and the uncertain and the deviation from the average up and down. But the upside is much worse than the downside.
Yeah,
So,
and I think the advantage we have is we deal in dollars, versus the temperatures changing, the drought. We can really quantify that these are dollars of increasing damage and loss that we're seeing as a result of climate change.
one last question: have any economists been using your work in their modeling of damages in their climate models yet? Has that been part?
Well, I mean, not that I know of. I mean, people could always, use our work, but we're not working closely with any
Like
economists to model anything, but we'd be happy to work with you, Larry, if you want to do something jointly.
That would be a lot of fun. I think we could definitely benefit. We're trying to get a big project going, we have a 3 million equation model that of the entire globe, 18 regions, that all these generations that are selfish and happily leaving more carbon, burning more fossil fuels. But we can, look at putting on a global carbon tax, and this could be imposed in different ways, not just carbon taxation, but permitting and so forth, different ways to do the same thing in terms of the policy. But what we're focused on is how you can do that, but also make everybody better off by getting people in the future who are going to benefit from this policy to, in effect, pay people in the present by, for example, cutting other taxes. If you put on a carbon tax and the price at the pump goes up, well, you can take other taxes and cut them. So on balance, current people that are not going to suffer from the climate change that's coming would be better off to the same, to exactly to the same percentage, to many decimal places, improvement in welfare as those in the future. So this, the good thing about an externality, about screwing things up, about not getting, not pricing the damage I'm imposing on somebody else, is that when we fix it, when we fix that kind of market failure, there's resources that can be redistributed across everybody so that everybody can be better off. So when you have an inefficiency, when you fix it, the gains from fixing the inefficiency can be spread. And that's the message that has been lost in the entire modeling of climate change, because the modeling has been done based on simplified model frameworks that don't have 3 million equations, are easily solved, but don't take into account the fact that, hey, we don't have kind of a social planner coming, God coming down to earth and saying, here's how I care about current and future generations, and here's what we should be doing, and here's my paper, and I'm submitting it, and it got published, and I got tenure, and that's the end of the story. That's basically what climate economics has been for decades, and it's been off base because it's been easy to do, but fundamentally put us at generational war between different generations. My God is better than your God in terms of this, how we model things. We should have somebody who's more concerned about future generations. Somebody else says, no, we should have a social planner who's less concerned. That's religion. That's not economics. Economics is getting to a win-win and using the resources from fixing things to do that. So I want to thank you so much, Karen. This has been really super interesting, and we are going to be in touch.
Okay, thank you, Larry.